Fighting has intensified in southern Gaza. Israel's ground offensive is centered around Khan Younis as the humanitarian situation continues to worsen by the hour in the besieged strip, and calls for protecting human rights for Gazans grows. Washington's support for Israel remains undeterred. Earlier on Saturday, Israeli strikes killed 6 in Khan Younis, while 5 Excuse me for that. Early on Saturday, Israeli strikes killed 6 in Khan Younis and 5 in Rafah. In the last 24 hours, over 130 people have been reported dead. According to Hamas-run health ministry, while Hamas says it fired rockets towards Raim in southern Israel, while overnight Israel conducted deadly strikes on Al-Zawadiyah and Nuseirat in central Gaza, Rafah and Khan Younis in the south, and Gaza City in the north. According to Hamas, about 17,500 people have been killed in Gaza. Aid workers warned that Gaza's humanitarian system is on the verge of collapse. Vast areas of Gaza have been reduced to rubble. People are suffering from dire shortages of food, fuel, water and medicine. 80% of the population has been displaced. United Nations agencies say there is now effectively nowhere safe to go as the situation worsens in Gaza. Israel's allies are also facing the heat.
هذا آخر مكان إلنا يعني إحنا وين بدنا نروح بعد هيك إلنا الله بس بنناشد يعني الناس النظيفة واللي عندها دين والناس المحترمة والناس اللي في الخارج في الدول الخارجية يعني تعملنا حاجة منيحة إلنا تعيشنا عيشة محترمة عيشة كويسة بدناش حروب وبدناش غيره بدنا نعيش عيشة كويسة إحنا تعبنا.
Well, this comes after the United States vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. The step drew condemnation from the Arab nations and Turkey, while it was praised by Israel.
This text also failed to acknowledge that Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorism, consistent with international law. This is a right to which all states are entitled. As I stated earlier today, no country could or should tolerate what Hamas did on October 7th.
Israel says 93 of its soldiers have been killed in Gaza and 2 others were severely injured in a failed bid to rescue hostages. Hamas earlier said a hostage was killed in the operation. United States has been standing behind Israel like a rock since the war began. Earlier, amid the reports of U.S. giving a deadline to Israel for war in Gaza, Washington clarified that there is no deadline on Gaza war, while emphasizing that Israel must minimize civilian casualties. The U.S. also highlighted that there is a gap between Israel's promises to protect civilians and the outcome, while Israel says it is providing details about which areas are safe for civilians and how to reach them.
We continue to recognize the extraordinary difficulty of this task, as Israel is dealing with a terrorist adversary that intentionally embeds itself with civilians. But again, Israel has an obligation to do everything possible to put a premium on protecting civilians and maximizing humanitarian assistance.
Washington provides billions of dollars in military aid to Israel, and now more could be coming its way. Reuters says Biden administration has been urging U.S. Congress to approve the sale of 45,000 shells for Israel's Merkava tanks for use against Hamas. This is not a part of President Joe Biden's $110.5 billion supplemental request that includes funds for Ukraine and Israel. Committees take 20 days to review the request, but the U.S. State Department is reportedly pushing the congressional committees to quickly approve the transaction. The administration is also thinking of using Arms Export Control Act emergency authorities to allow a portion of the ammunition shells to bypass the committee. As the war intensifies, how and where exactly the U.S. weapons are used in the conflict has come under more scrutiny. Retired Colonel Rich Outzen is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. He is now joining us live on WION The World is One. Colonel Rich, good to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Eric.
While leaders, international rights groups and United Nations officials have criticized the United States for vetoing a United Nations resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza and failing to halt the war, and now there is speculation that the U.S. president is pushing Congress to approve tank shells for Israel's war in Gaza. What is your reaction to these two events?
Well, on the first, I am sympathetic to the efforts of the contact group that was visiting Washington, D.C. yesterday. They were pushing an argument similar to that of the UN resolution that basically says, there needs to be a ceasefire. They're pushing for it a little bit more quickly than I would do. But the second part of what the contact group is saying, I think, is the most important, which is that any ceasefire will only make sense if there's going to be a restored political momentum, something that will make sure this never happens again. Now, the Israelis say this can never happen again, meaning October 7th. And I think that's right. And that's why the United States is continuing to support the military operations against Hamas. However, that will be meaningless and we'll be here again in 2 or 3 years unless there really is a substantive effort to fix the political conundrum of the Palestinian people, especially those in Gaza. So yesterday you saw this interesting visit of foreign ministers, ministerial level delegation that included Egyptians, Turks, Qataris, and a number of others that are pushing the United States, while it supports Israel's right to self-defense, to also demand that there is political progress at the end of this process. So that's my response. I think it's right for the United States to support, with artillery shells and tank shells and everything else, what's necessary to destroy the tunnel network. But we are also the only country in a position to press Israel to make the kind of political commitments to a two-state solution that will be necessary to make sure we don't find ourselves here again in 3 years.
Colonel Rich, but the Human Rights Watch says that the U.S. risks complicity in war crimes by giving Israel weapons and diplomatic cover. Could that be the cause? And how can the U.S. avoid that?
Well, so the law of warfare is the law of land warfare and the law of war in general, the Geneva Conventions and others are easy to talk about but hard to apply in specific cases. Now, you can find, when there is a great evidentiary trail, specific acts that are by their very nature against the law of war, executions of civilians and so forth. But the whole issue of collateral damage is a little vague. And for instance, siege warfare, this is in some sense a case of siege warfare, sieging Gaza to get at Hamas, is actually not a violation of the law of war. The use of disproportionate force is, but proving what's proportionate and disproportionate is quite tricky for lawyers. So I don't think that's what's driving the U.S. interest here. I think the U.S. is concerned, obviously, about civilian casualties and the fact that well over half, perhaps 2/3 of the Palestinian casualties have been civilians. That hurts the conscience, and it's bad politically. I don't think that there's a vulnerability in the case of the U.S. on war crimes per se, since we're not a combatant to it. But look, the Democrats, and Joe Biden, of course, is a Democrat, and his administration cares deeply about human rights by their own account, has to be troubled in their conscience, not so much about the war crimes, just about the civilian suffering. And I think that's what's driving this dual track of trying, yes, to support Israel militarily, but also to demand a higher level of care and a political solution.
Finally, Colonel Rich, talks of a ceasefire or truce have ceased for some days now. Why do you think that is? And what do you make of the international community calling for a total or even full ceasefire?
Well, I think it's actually a very well-founded concern for the civilian deaths that is causing much of the international outrage and the pressure. As a military man, though, I see the other side of this as well, which is that Israel, were it to stop now, while there's still Hamas infrastructure, the tunnel network, the ability to make their own homemade rockets and so forth, and not totally cut off from their Iranian supply chain, the job would be left half done. I think sequencing matters here. I'm glad the world is outraged about the civilian deaths, and they should continue to press for a ceasefire. And the United States should continue to put enough time on the clock for Israel to get the essential military task done. So the tension between the two, entirely understandable and in some ways admirable. But I, for one, I am with the administration on this. Let's let the Israeli Defense Force do the job of removing the tunnel network, and then let's really press Israel and all the parties for a substantive political solution to this.
Retired Colonel Rich Artzen is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. Colonel Rich, as always, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Have a great weekend, Eric. Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.